Today we are standing on the ramparts of Jerusalem in the year 701 BCE. It is the sound of an empire that has never known defeat. The Assyrians, led by the ruthless Sennacherib, are not just an army. They are a tidal wave of iron and blood. They have already swallowed the northern kingdom of Israel and deported the 10 tribes. Now they are at the doorstep of Zion. But today we look at Sennacherib through a different lens, not as a master of destiny, but as a tool gripped in an invisible hand. We begin with the warning in verse 5.
Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger. The staff in their hand is my fury.
Why would God use a wicked nation like Assyria to punish his people? Think of this as the mystery of the instrument. The word for rod here, mate, can mean a guidance stick or a heavy club. God is using Sennacherib as a staff of fury. The irony is that Sennacherib thinks he is conquering by his own genius, but in the eyes of the Creator, he is as significant as a wooden stick. The woe is pronounced because the rod has forgotten it is being held. The mission continues in verse 6.
I send him against a godless nation, and against the people of my wrath I command him, to take spoil and seize plunder, and to tread them down like the mire of the streets.
Here is the divine commission. God identifies his own people as a godless nation because of their hypocrisy. The punishment fits the crime. Because they treated the poor like dirt, they are now handed over to be trodden down like mire by Sennacherib's legions. But the internal motive is revealed in verse 7.
But he does not so intend, and his heart does not so think. But it is in his heart to destroy, and to cut off nations not a few.
This is the psychological core of the drama. Sennacherib does not believe he is being used. He believes he is the one using the world. He is not directed toward God. Mystically, his heart is a vessel empty of light and filled with pure ego. Like a hurricane that serves a purpose in the climate without intending to, Sennacherib is a raw, unrefined force. While God intends discipline, Sennacherib intends annihilation. This gap in intent is why he is held responsible. Sennacherib's own words are captured in verses 8 and 9.
For he says, Are not my princes altogether kings? Is not Calno like Carchemish? Is not Hamath like Arpad? Is not Samaria like Damascus?
Sennacherib tracks his path through the graveyards of the world, from the northern fortresses of Carchemish to the fall of Samaria. By equating Samaria with the pagan city of Damascus, he signals that Israel's spiritual identity meant nothing to him. Notice the phrase, "Are not my princes altogether kings?" This is a recurring event in the history of pride. Every empire that reaches its peak experiences this expansion of the ego, where the leader's will becomes so absolute that even his servants are granted the status of kings over the territories they crush. Sennacherib is claiming that the Assyrian state has become the new god of the earth, where his word alone creates royalty out of nothing. His logic extends further in verses 10 and 11.
As my hand has reached to the kingdoms of the idols, whose graven images exceeded those of Jerusalem and of Samaria, shall I not do to Jerusalem and her idols as I have done to Samaria and her images?
Sennacherib makes a fatal logical error. He views the invisible God of Jerusalem as just another idol. He argues that since nations with more idols were defeated, Jerusalem stands no chance. He views the holy temple vessels as mere art to be captured and displayed in his palace. The divine response arrives in verse 12.
When the Lord has finished all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of Sennacherib and the glory of his haughty looks.
God allows the rod to operate only until the refining of Israel is complete. Once the work is done, the focus shifts to the fruit of Sennacherib's heart. Arrogance is a spiritual poison. God allows the tool to operate only until its pride becomes a threat to the moral order of the universe. History shows this law repeatedly. A power rises for a purpose, but is brought down when it forgets its source. The king's pride is detailed in verse 13.
For he says,
By the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I have understanding. I have removed the boundaries of peoples, and have robbed their treasures, and I have brought down like a mighty man the inhabitants.
Here Sennacherib claims three things: power, wisdom, and understanding. He believes he has rearranged the map of the world by his own genius. Removing boundaries is a profound theological violation. He is overriding the limits God set for nations. He sees the world as a blank canvas for his own will. By calling himself a mighty man, he tries to usurp the title of the Abir, the mighty one, acting as the one who decides who lives and who dies. The chilling analogy follows in verse 14.
And my hand has found as a nest the riches of the peoples, and as one gathers eggs that are left, have I gathered all the earth. And there was none that moved a wing, or opened the mouth, or chirped.
Let's look deeply at this nest analogy. It is one of the most chilling descriptions of dehumanization in the Bible. To Sennacherib, nations are not people with families, histories, or souls. They are merely eggs in a nest. He describes them as eggs that are left, abandoned property. In his spiritual blindness, he looks at the world and sees no parent, no protector, and no God. He believes that the owner of the world has gone on vacation or doesn't exist. He isn't stealing in his own mind, he is simply gathering what has been left behind by a weak and absent creator. Then he describes the silence. None that moved a wing, or opened the mouth, or chirped. In nature, when a predator approaches a nest, there is usually a chirp, a cry of alarm or a prayer for help. But Sennacherib's terror is so absolute that the world has gone silent. He has paralyzed the very voice of humanity. This silence is the peak of his ego. He thinks he has silenced the soul of the earth itself. He believes that because no one is chirping or crying out to God, God must not be listening. He doesn't realize that the silence isn't proof of God's absence. It's the vacuum that draws in God's judgment. Isaiah mocks this hubris in verse 15.
Shall the axe boast over him who hews with it? Or shall the saw exalt itself over him who moves it? As if a rod should move those who lift it up, or as if a staff should lift up him who is not wood.
A brilliant satire of power. Sennacherib is a piece of wood trying to lift the human who moves him. History is littered with axes and saws that thought they were the woodsman. The consequence is described in verse 16.
Therefore the Lord of hosts, will send a wasting disease among his fat warriors, and under his glory there shall be kindled a burning like the burning of fire.
Sennacherib's fat warriors represent more than just individual soldiers. They represent the sheer physical abundance and wealth of his empire. In the ancient world, fatness was a symbol of being well supplied, prosperous, and physically overwhelming. Sennacherib's army was the best-fed, best-equipped machine on earth. But look at the sentence. God sends a wasting disease among this abundance. From a historical and political perspective, this means the sudden depletion of Sennacherib's strength. Everything that made his army fat, their supplies, their health, their numerical advantage, is about to be drained away. The burning like the burning of fire refers to the suddenness of the collapse. Just as a fire can destroy a massive stockpile of grain in minutes, God will cause the foundational strength of the Assyrians to evaporate. It's a message that physical prosperity and military numbers are fragile. They can be wasted away in one instant when the divine support is withdrawn. The light turns to flame in verse 17.
And the light of Israel shall be for a fire, and his Holy One for a flame, and it shall burn and devour his thorns and his briars in one day.
The light of Israel becomes a consuming fire. Here, thorns and briars represent the common infantry, the massive multitude of soldiers who were numerous and painful like weeds, but utterly defenseless once the fire of justice was ignited. In one night, 185,000 soldiers would die. The light that comforted the king of Judah was the same flame that incinerated the pride of the empire in one day. The total collapse is mapped out in verse 18.
And he shall consume the glory of his forest and of his fruitful field, both soul and body. And it shall be as when a standard-bearer faints.
This verse describes a total, systemic collapse using 4 distinct layers of the empire. First, the forest represents the sheer density and organization of Sennacherib's military machine. God strikes it so that the loss of organized power turns a disciplined army into a chaotic, directionless thicket. Second, the fruitful field refers to the empire's vast wealth and the logistical supply lines that feed the war machine. Its destruction means that even if soldiers survive, their resources become barren and useless, leaving them with no means to continue. Third, the judgment of both soul and body signifies a final failure where both the external weapons and the internal life force are drained away, leaving nothing to rebuild because the very will to exist is extinguished. Finally, the image of a fainting standard-bearer describes a psychological melting at the highest levels of leadership. When the generals lose heart and the flag drops, a contagious panic spreads through the ranks, causing the entire spirit of the army to evaporate into history. The final count is given in verse 19.
And the rest of the trees of his forest shall be few in number, so that a child could record them.
Ancient tradition suggests only a handful of soldiers survived. To an empire that boasted of innumerable troops, being reduced to a number so small that a child can count them on their fingers is the ultimate humiliation for Sennacherib. His glory is not just defeated, it is erased. Now we reach the turning point. Shir Yashub, a remnant shall return. The turning point comes in verses 20 and 21.
And it shall come to pass in that day that the remnant of Israel, and such as are escaped of the house of Jacob, shall no more again lean upon him that smote them, but shall lean upon the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. A remnant shall return, even the remnant of Jacob, unto the mighty God.
This moment is the fulfillment of the symbolic name given to Isaiah's son, Shir Yashub, which means a remnant shall return. For those who survived the fire, returning isn't just about a physical journey back to the land of Israel. It is about returning to a state of spiritual and national sovereignty. For years, the people lived in fear of the mighty men of Assyria. But Isaiah reveals that when they return to El Gibor, the mighty God, that fear evaporates. To lean on the Holy One in truth means standing upright and independent, no longer shaped by the intimidation of an empire, but by the strength of their own Creator. The refining process is explained in verse 22.
For though your people, O Israel, be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them shall return. A destruction is determined, overflowing with righteousness.
God's judgment is described here with incisive, surgical precision. While the nation was vast, as numerous as the sand of the sea, this trial acted as a filter. Only a remnant remains, because only a remnant was refined enough to carry the future of the covenant. The destruction that takes place is surprisingly described as overflowing with righteousness. This means that the catastrophe wasn't a loss of control, it was a form of charity, a tzedakah, that cleared away the spiritual debts of the nation and allowed the survivors to start with a clean, holy slate. The question of how far this destruction goes is answered in verse 23.
For a consummation, and that determined, the Lord, the God of hosts, shall make in the midst of all the earth.
This verse elevates the collapse of Sennacherib from a local event to a total world reset. Because Assyria was the sole, unipolar world power of that era, controlling Egypt, the Levant, and Mesopotamia, their sudden disappearance at the walls of Jerusalem created a massive power vacuum that affected the whole earth. Isaiah uses the term midst of all the earth to describe Jerusalem. In a geographic and spiritual sense, Jerusalem is the navel or center of the world. When God performs a consummation, a final completion or destruction, at the center, the ripples go out to every corner of the globe. This was a global, political, and moral reboot. By breaking the head of the empire in the heart of the world, God proved to all nations that the old way of brutal, godless imperialism had reached its expiration date. The comfort for the survivors begins in verse 24.
Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, O my people that dwell in Zion, be not afraid of Assyria, though he smite thee with the rod, and lift up his staff against thee, after the manner of Egypt.
God addresses the survivors as my people. This is a restoration of the covenant identity. He tells them not to be afraid of the physical staff that Sennacherib lifts against them, and he points back to history, after the manner of Egypt. This is a historical code. God is reminding them that the superpower of Egypt once looked invincible, and yet it crumbled in a single night of miracles. He is asking them to choose faith over sight, recognizing that the staff in Sennacherib's hand is only effective as long as God allows it. The timing is revealed in verse 25.
For yet a very little while, and the indignation shall be accomplished, and my anger shall be to their destruction.
This verse provides the timeline for salvation, and it contains a powerful lesson in the final minute. The phrase, a very little while, describes the final moments of a crisis when the darkness is at its absolute thickest. Often, salvation comes in a blink of an eye, but that blink happens only after the indignation or the refining fire has finished its work. Historically, this represents a quantum leap. For centuries, history seems to move slowly under the boot of empires, and then, in a very little while, the entire world resets. This is the friction of the old era passing away. Sennacherib's empire was a global structure, yet its end was determined by a moment of transition that felt brief but was final. It reminds us that no matter how long the struggle feels, the end is often sudden, occurring precisely when the old world has nothing more to teach us. The nature of the victory is described in verse 26.
And the Lord of hosts shall stir up against him a scourge, as in the slaughter of Midian at the rock of Oreb. And as his rod was over the sea, so shall he lift it up after the manner of Egypt.
This victory mirrors the greatest hits of history. Like the story of Gideon in Judges 7, where 300 men defeated a massive Midianite army not through swords, but through the sound of trumpets and the breaking of pitchers. This victory is won through terror. Sennacherib's forces would experience a confusion of the soul, a psychological meltdown where they turn on each other without a single Jewish arrow being fired. At the Red Sea, the rod did not just strike the water, it changed the very laws of nature. This destruction is metaphysical. The siege, which looked like a death sentence, would become the stage for a miracle that defied every natural rule of warfare. The secret of the breakthrough is in verse 27.
And it shall come to pass in that day, that his burden shall be taken away from off thy shoulder, and his yoke from off thy neck, and the yoke shall be destroyed because of the oil.
Now we come to one of the most profound and misunderstood metaphors in prophecy: salvation through oil logic. To understand this, we have to look at the relationship between the yoke and the oil. The yoke is an external structure. It is the harness of empire, the pressure of history, and the perceived fate imposed by a conqueror. It is rigid and predictable. Wisdom, however, is an internal structure. When Isaiah speaks of oil, he is talking about the wisdom of Torah that has become more than just abstract ideas. It has become substance. It is wisdom that has overflowed from the mind into the very presence of the people. There is a unique property to oil. It seeps and it spreads. It does not stay contained. This is the mechanism of redemption. As internal wisdom increases through the crushing pressure of the siege, much like olives only produce oil when they are pressed, it begins to spill over into lived reality. When the internal world becomes larger and more substantial than the external system, the conditions for the yoke to function simply vanish. A yoke requires rigidity and compliance to work, but oil introduces fluidity and lubrication. When wisdom overflows into physical reality, it shifts perception. You no longer see yourself as a slave. You no longer recognize the legitimacy of the oppressor. As this internal authority reaches the surface of reality, the external domination becomes irrelevant. The yoke doesn't just break because of a physical fight. It breaks because the oil has removed the friction and the grip that allowed the yoke to stay on the neck. It is a perceptual revolution where inner illumination dissolves the mechanisms of control. Now we reach the final movement of the chapter. Picture a highway of hill towns, each one a domino falling toward Jerusalem as the shadow of the empire stretches south. Isaiah maps this out with terrifying precision. The invasion route is tracked in verses 28 and 29.
He's come to Iath. He's passed through Migron. At Michmas he stores his baggage. They are gone over the pass. They have taken up their lodging at Geba. Ramah trembles. Gibeah of Saul is fled.
Sennacherib chooses a jagged northern path through a canyon considered a death trap. He stores his baggage at Michmas, moving with Blitzkrieg speed to surprise Jerusalem. By passing through Gibeah of Saul, he attempts to humiliate the very concept of Jewish monarchy. He signals that if the first king's home city fled, Hezekiah is next. But David's city, Zion, would stand firm, proving that Hezekiah's merit was rooted in a covenantal faithfulness that Saul lacked, but Hezekiah possessed. The panic spreads in verse 30.
Cry aloud with thy voice, O daughter of Gallim. Hearken, O Laish, O thou poor Anathoth.
In this verse, we see the ripple effect of the invasion. These cities, Gallim, Laish, and Anathoth, were clustered in the hills just north of Jerusalem. As Sennacherib's army moved, the valleys acted like a megaphone, carrying the sounds of war directly into the ears of the capital. The crying aloud was a warning signal sent from one hilltop to the next. By the time the cry reached Jerusalem, the city knew that the protective circle of surrounding towns had been completely punctured. The inhabitants are not just screaming, they are broadcasting the reality that the final defense has been reached. The limit of human effort is seen in verse 31.
Madmenah is in flight. The inhabitants of Gebim flee to cover.
As we move into verse 31, the language shifts from physical cities to states of mind. While Madmenah and Gebim were real places, Isaiah uses them to represent the limit of human effort. The name Gebim implies a frantic gathering of strength or seeking refuge. It describes inhabitants trying to bolster themselves in the only way they know how, by huddling together in secret places. This verse shows us the two natural human responses to terror. You either run, Madmina, or you hide, Gebim. But the profound insight here is that whether you run or you hide, you are still trapped by the external system. This sets the stage for the miracle that is about to occur. It teaches us that when man has no more moves left, when the running and the hiding have both failed, that is precisely when God moves. The final standoff occurs in verse 32.
This very day he shall halt at Nob. He shakes his hand at the mount of the house of Zion, the hill of Jerusalem.
Sennacherib arrives at Nob, the high ground overlooking the temple. He halts for two reasons. His army was utterly exhausted from the Blitzkrieg through the mountain passes, and Nob provided the perfect high ground to look down on the temple and the palace. He felt the victory was so certain that he could afford to wait. However, there is a dramatic spiritual boundary being crossed here. Sennacherib represents the total peak power of the physical world. He reaches the very edge of the holy, and there he is forced to halt. There is an invisible boundary that raw power simply cannot cross. When the text says he shakes his hand at the Mount of Zion, it isn't just a gesture of victory. It is the deep, subconscious frustration of the materialist. He realizes that even though he has the bigger army, the faster horses, and the high ground, there is an X factor, a weight of holiness that he cannot grasp, understand, or defeat with iron. He shakes his hand in a desperate attempt to dominate a spiritual reality that is already far beyond his reach. By waiting just a few hours to mock the city, he misses his astrological window and allows the divine fire to ignite. The judgment falls in verse 33.
Behold, the Lord of hosts, shall lop the boughs with terror, and the high ones of stature shall be hewn down, and the lofty shall be humbled.
The great woodsman acts. God strikes with a supernatural terror that lops the boughs, Sennacherib's elite officers, away from their leader in an instant. The high ones of stature mentioned here refers directly back to those princes Sennacherib boasted of earlier. These were the men who considered themselves altogether kings, now being hewn down by the only true sovereign. Their height and status meant nothing when the Creator chose to trim the forest. The end of the empire is sealed in verse 34.
And he shall cut down the thickets of the forest with iron, and Lebanon shall fall by a mighty one.
Finally, God moves to clear the rest of the ranks. The thickets of the dense Assyrian masses are cleared as if by iron. Lebanon is known for the tallest trees. This singular tall tree symbolizes Sennacherib himself and his empire at its absolute peak. The mighty one, God himself, swings the axe. This clearing of arrogance was necessary to make room for what comes next. Isaiah 10 is the blueprint for the final redemption. Sennacherib is the prototype of Magog. Just as Sennacherib brought a global coalition to the gates of Jerusalem only to be struck down by a divine scourge, so too will the final forces of human arrogance fall. When the recurring cycle of pride leads the forest of human ego to become too thick, overshadowing the light of the world, the mighty one always swings the axe. Isaiah 10 leaves us at the edge of a cleared field. Sennacherib's empire is gone. The stage is set. Next time, in chapter 11, we see what grows from the ruins. I want everyone to understand the oil that breaks the yoke. Let me know in the comments which part of this journey resonated most with you. Until next time, remember, when the world's rod is raised, the mighty one is already at work.